Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Canfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, a community working to promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out the list of Harbinger podcasts at harbingermedianetwork.com. One particular Harbinger Media Network podcast I'd like to put in a plug for this month is Cited, that's C-I-T-E-D. It's been relaunched, and they're doing a really interesting series on the rationality wars, looking at the political and intellectual battles to define what counts as rational and irrational, with episodes so far that cover crowd psychology, looking at sexuality and liberation psychology, and other topics that are definitely worth listening. So do check out Cited on the Harbinger Media Network. Many of capitalism's champions no longer project the confident optimism that they displayed between the collapse of so-called actually existing socialism in Eastern Europe and the USSR at the end of the 1980s and the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009. But defenders of the current social order still marshal an array of arguments to support the idea that, whatever its flaws, there's no alternative to the status quo, other than perhaps the collapse of civilization. One way they defend capitalism is with anti-communism. During the second half of the 20th century, under the banner of anti-communism, the United States and its allies and proxies went to great lengths to destroy the left in the global south. They carried out campaigns of murder that killed over 1 million people, and that figure does not include the even larger number of people who were killed in war or by starvation or disease caused by anti-communist governments. Under the banner of anti-communism, the US, Canada, and other Western states also used repressive measures against leftists within their own countries. Anti-communism is the ideology expressed in a US congressional resolution that was passed in 2023. I'll quote from that resolution. Congress denounces socialism in all its forms and opposes the implementation of socialist policies in the United States of America. It then goes on to back that up with dubious assertions, including socialist ideology necessitates a concentration of power that has time and time again collapsed into communist regimes, totalitarian rule, and brutal dictatorships. Socialism has repeatedly led to famine and mass murders and the killing of over 100 million people worldwide. Many of the greatest crimes in history were committed by socialist ideologues, including Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, Fidel Castro, Pol Pot, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un, Daniel Ortega, Hugo Chavez, and Nicolas Maduro. Now, while the resolution left socialism undefined, this is clearly a license to stigmatize even social reforms like public health care, price controls, and public housing. The implication is that these are steps towards a so-called communist tyranny because they interfere with markets. Also, even though China today is very different from China under Mao, anti-communism can be harnessed to motivate support for the US, Canadian, and Australian governments in their increasingly aggressive rivalry with the state led by the Chinese Communist Party. The closest thing to a Bible that contemporary anti-communists have is the Black Book of Communism, originally published in French at the close of the 20th century. This is the book where it's the source of the unreliable figure of over 100 million dead that's found in the US congressional resolution. The central idea of the book is that communism in all its forms shares an evil criminal essence that makes it the most murderous force in human history. There's supposedly a straight line from the Russian Revolution to mass murder under Joseph Stalin when he headed the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Contexts, social forces, all of these things are irrelevant. From this perspective, what matters is that communism has lethal ideas. As the historian Enzo Traverso puts it, communism is seen as criminal as both ideology and reality, and always identical in all times and places. But this interpretation found in the Black Book of Communism and similar sources is not at all original. It's just recycling the old McCarthyist theory of a communist conspiracy that was developed in the United States in the 1950s. This is not just about history. It has an unambiguous message for the present. In a book called Stalinism and the Dialectics of Saturn, a book which is quite useful, I think, in spite of its very orthodox Trotskyist perspective, which I don't share, the historian Douglas Green sums this message up nicely. He says that, according to this ideology, communism is a messianic and totalitarian democratic pseudo-religion that wrongly promises an earthly paradise. But trying to create a paradise on earth can only lead to extraordinary horrors. As Green puts it, This damns in advance any attempt to change the world. Anti-communism often lumps together communism and fascism under the banner of totalitarianism. This way of demonizing communism is reflected by, for example, marking August the 23rd as Black Ribbon Day, and the idea that communism and Nazism inflicted a so-called double genocide on the nations of Eastern Europe. It's in Eastern Europe that this ideology has gone furthest. It's been embedded in laws that prohibit the public display of communist symbols or the promotion of communist ideas. In Eastern Europe, right-wing nationalists have succeeded in making communism appear the greatest evil in history. This anti-communism devotes far more attention to people in Eastern Europe killed by communists than to the many more people who were murdered by the Nazis. For example, in Budapest, the House of Terror Museum has one room on the Holocaust and about 20 rooms about communism. But if we look at the war between the USSR and Nazi Germany between 1941 and 1945, it started as the USSR's self-defense against the German invasion that, to quote Enzo Traverso, was a colonial war with no distinction between combatants and civilians, in which whole peoples were to be made into slaves while others were exterminated. So while the USSR did end up occupying Eastern Europe, its armies certainly did commit atrocities, and the states it established in Eastern Europe were repressive. All of this was fundamentally different from what the Nazis did. Eastern European anti-communists also generally downplay how many people in their countries actually collaborated with Nazism. By treating communism as history's worst evil, this kind of anti-communism opens the door to treating Nazism as preferable, as a lesser evil. Even when anti-communists don't go so far as to apologize for fascism, institutionalizing anti-communism creates a hostile environment for anyone who wants to try to encourage collective action on the part of working class and oppressed people to improve their lives. Anti-communism licenses the smearing of their efforts as alien agitation, hostile to the national community. And this isn't just a problem in countries which have well-known anti-communist legislation on the books, such as Poland and Indonesia. There are still anti-communist laws on the books in parts of the United States today. These laws are tools that right-wing politicians can use against anyone that they label as communist. And today, for people on the far right, like Donald Trump, people who believe in the threat of a mythical so-called cultural Marxism, even liberal supporters of equal rights for queer and trans people can be labeled as communist. So, of course, we should push back against anti-communism. The question is how to push back against it. One way is through so-called anti-communism. And this really involves a double position. First, rejecting anti-communism, and second, adopting an attitude to the USSR and similar so-called socialist societies that's at least somewhat sympathetic. So it shouldn't be difficult to understand why many people who are critical of capitalism think this way. After all, we're all familiar with the capitalist status quo, which is horrible, and its defenders demonize communism. So sympathy for whatever capitalism's champions are denouncing can come easily, especially for people who don't know very much about these societies that anti-communists portray as evil. But there's another way to oppose anti-communism, a perspective that opposes both capitalism and so-called actually existing socialism as ways of organizing society that are rooted in domination. And we can see this expressed in a phrase from the radical left of the 1960s: the communist world is not communist and the free world is not free. But where Trump and Biden put a minus sign, today's anti-communists tend to put a plus sign. So when the subject is so-called communism, anti-communists generally combine sympathy with at least some criticism of the perceived shortcomings of these societies and movements. But sometimes today's anti-communism flows into outright endorsement of some version of so-called communism, whether that of Stalin or Mao in the past, or China and Cuba today. This isn't a new phenomenon. Anti-communism was a feature of a culture of part of the New Left of the 1960s and 70s. Tom Hayden and Stoughton Lynd, who were central organizers in the mid-1960s of the emerging movement in the United States against the war in Vietnam, they proclaimed, "We refuse to be anti-communist." They adopted this kind of stance. Many people in North America and Western Europe who were part of the movements of that time started by adopting an anti-communist stance and then went on to become involved with what was often called the New Communist Movement, which was a sizable current of the radical left that looked above all to China for inspiration. Today, long after the disintegration of the New Communist Movement and the end of the Cold War between the US-led so-called free world and the so-called communist states, anti-communism takes a somewhat different form, one that's more often ready to acknowledge that there were problems in these actually existing socialist societies. Some people on the left think that this is the only alternative to a right-wing position, taking an anti-communist stance. They don't even acknowledge the possibility of refusing both anti-communism and nostalgia for actually existing socialism. They don't recognize the possibility that it's possible to be deeply critical of both capitalism and the so-called socialist societies, from a radical perspective that yearns for a better world. One widely read social democratic writer who's popularized the kind of anti-communist stance is Kristen Ghodsee, the US academic whose best-known book is the 2018 Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism. Ghodsee argues that in these countries, there were many positive aspects. The state guaranteed citizens employment and housing. It provided public childcare and implemented other measures to promote women's education and participation in paid work, including in jobs that had not traditionally been done by women. There was a baby in all that bathwater. It's time we got around to saving it, is her conclusion. Now, these public services and rights undoubtedly existed, but this way of evaluating them is what anti-capitalist feminist Sophie Lewis calls cherry picking from the Soviet policy pantheon. It treats those services and rights as if we can consider them separately from the oppressive features of these societies. It's a lot like the approach taken by people who say we can't be anti-capitalist because Western capitalist societies have positive features like civil liberties, multi-party elections, and unions that aren't simply arms of the state. As Sophie Lewis puts it, Ghodsee never asks the question of what an anti-capitalist, non-capitalist, post-capitalist society worthy of those names might actually look like. In recent years, anti-communism has become more common on the left than it was for several decades after the collapse of the East Bloc. Often it's more of a mood that we can see in social industry posts, but it also crops up in articles in publications like Jacobin, articles whose outlook on so-called actually existing socialism is nostalgic or a kind of it wasn't so bad stance. But that's really different from being ruthlessly critical of social domination and assessing both capitalism and so-called actually existing socialism from that perspective along the lines of the slogan, the communist world is not communist and the free world is not free. The soil of anti-communism today is fertile ground for perspectives that aren't just sympathetic to so-called actually existing socialism, but are actually enthusiastic about it. Such enthusiasts often embrace the ideology of Marxism-Leninism. Critics on the left have often dubbed these enthusiasts tankies, although that term is now sometimes also used by anti-communists in an indiscriminate way to smear anyone who opposes Western imperialism. One of the most widely read champions of this kind of enthusiastic perspective is the writer Michael Parenti. Parenti labels all criticism of so-called actually existing socialism by people who consider themselves on the left, except mild criticism by people like himself, as what he calls left anti-communism. But this is a classic amalgam. It lumps together what are really quite different ways of criticizing these societies, as if the criticism of social democrats, who of course are advocates of a regulated capitalism, and they really are anti-communist, as if that criticism is the same as the critique made by those of us who criticize these societies for not being in transition to socialism, as their rulers claimed. It's not being in transition to communism in the sense of a classless and stateless society of freedom. So after lumping together all criticisms of these societies by people who identify, in some sense, with the left, Parenti then goes on to smear them all with the brush of anti-communism, associating them with McCarthyism. So what Parenti does is assume precisely what he actually needs to demonstrate, namely that these societies really were moving towards communism. Now, Parenti responds to the argument that these societies were not in transition to communism by labeling it a pure socialism view, ahistorical and non-falsifiable. It cannot be tested against the actualities of history. But this is nothing more than intellectual sleight of hand. Again, it just assumes that these societies must have been developing towards communism. It doesn't show that they were. It doesn't develop any kind of case based on the evidence of what he calls the actualities of history that really prove that they were in transition towards a classless and stateless society of freedom. So Parenti is really quite shallow and evasive here. It's really what he's doing is making a weak attempt to deflect communist evaluation of these societies by simply repeating assumptions instead of offering serious arguments. Now, clearly, anti-communist accounts of so-called actually existing socialist societies are flimsy, but that doesn't justify the kind of naive or dishonest portrayals of them by people on the left who either ignore or dismiss well-established evidence. So, for example, we can now say without any doubt that the archives of the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs in the USSR, generally known by its Russian initials of NKVD, these archives reveal that in 1937-1938, its forces executed 681,692 people. Using these and other records that became available after the collapse of the USSR, historians J.R. Getty and Oleg Naumov estimated that in the 1930s, close to 1.5 million people were executed or died in the prisons, forced labor camps, labor colonies, and special settlements that made up the vast carceral system of the USSR at the time. That figure of 1.5 million does not include the much larger number of peasants who died while being forced into internal exile in the early 1930s, or people who died in the famine of 1932-1933. When we base ourselves on this kind of reliable research, it allows us to understand that when a writer like Parenti regretfully admits that Joseph Stalin did execute hundreds of Bolshevik leaders, which of course he certainly did, but the NKVD executed hundreds of thousands of people in 1937-38 alone, we can tell that what we're seeing when Parenti says this is really an effort to minimize the truth about repression. We do well to remember something that the historian E.H. Carr wrote. A historian must seek to bring into the picture all known or knowable facts relevant, in one sense or another, to the theme on which he's engaged and to the interpretation proposed. When a writer mentions that Stalin executed hundreds of leaders, but doesn't say anything about the mass executions and deaths from other causes that killed over 1 million people in the 1930s alone, again, not to mention those who died, for example, in the famine, this is clearly a deliberate move. So there's no question that we should challenge anti-communism, but the way to do this isn't through anti-communism. It's a serious mistake to reject anti-communism without making, at the same time, a clear, sober, and unhesitating communist critique of both the overtly capitalist world and the so-called socialist societies. A communist critique of the theory and politics of Marxism-Leninism propagated by the rulers of those societies and by political forces aligned with one or more of them, at least in the past, is also needed. If you're interested in learning more about the so-called socialist societies and the politics of left forces that supported them, check out episodes 3, 6, 8, and 11 of Victor's Children. Also, look out for the book on these societies, Marxism-Leninism, and the alternative tradition of anti-Stalinist communism that I'm writing. I'm happy to announce it's going to be entitled Red Flags, A Reckoning with Communism for the Future of the Left, and it's going to be published by Fernwood Publishing in 2025. Let's now go to the second part of this episode, my interview with John-Paul Himka about Ukrainian-Canadians, Ukraine, and the history and politics of anti-communism. So I'm very happy to be joined on this episode of Victor's Children by John-Paul Himka. Could you introduce yourself to listeners, please?
Sure. I'm a retired professor from the University of Alberta, and I've specialized in Ukrainian history all my academic career, and have worked on some sensitive topics such as the role of Ukrainian nationalists in the Holocaust, but also on, more gentle topics like the iconography of the Last Judgment, all kinds of things.
Thanks. So let's start by talking about anti-communist nationalism, because it's an influential ideology among Ukrainian Canadians and also among a number of other communities of people of Eastern European heritage in North America. So could you start by saying a little bit about the history of this ideology and how it came to be as influential as it did in these communities?
Well, I think, it starts with really the growth of anti-communism in Galicia and Volhynia and Bukovina, the Ukrainian territories that were outside the Soviet Union. In the 1920s, Ukrainians in these territories were really rather impressed with Soviet Ukraine and the cultural movement there, the church movements. It seemed like a time of incredible blossoming. And I would say that Sovietophilism was a major current in the thinking of Ukrainians in Western Ukraine in the 1920s. But that really ended late in the 20s and in the 30s in particular, as Stalin took over the direction of the country. He never ended Ukrainianization of the country until 1933, when it officially ended, but he started already in 1928 and then in 1930 persecuting the Ukrainian intelligentsia. And then, of course, there was the Soviet famine of 1932-33, which hit Ukrainians very hard. And then there was the Great Terror of 1937, which arrested and ended up in the murder of very many Ukrainian writers, artists, and others like that, so that there was almost no pro-Soviet thinking in the Western Ukrainian territories. And in addition to that, the Soviets in 1938 abolished the both the Polish Communist Party and the Communist Party of Western Ukraine. And then when they would come back in 1941, they would actually kill many of these people. So it was the crimes of the Stalinists which, to a great extent, soured pro-Soviet feelings among Ukrainians. And so that's kind of the origins of it, I think, is right there in that history that went on in Ukraine. People followed the history. They learned of the death of the artists and the writers and the musicians, and there were peasants who fled from Ukraine during the famine, they ended up in Poland or Romania, and they told horrible stories of what was going on there. So it was very hard for communism to be a cherished ideal among the Western Ukrainians. And in Ukraine itself, which was Soviet Ukraine, people there experienced the very horrors, which Western Ukraine was a reflection and intellectualization of it. But in Soviet Ukraine, people were actually experiencing all these horrors. They were losing their family, they were repressed. And later, let's say during the Nazi occupation, some of those who were very deeply collaborating were victims of Soviet repression.
I think this is helpful, especially for people who don't know anything about the history of the region before the end of the Second World War, or so that idea that there was ever admiration for what was happening in Ukraine within the USSR in the 1920s, outside its borders in those territories. I think it's something that often people don't know anything about. So the shift is pretty remarkable.
Yes, Communist Party of Western Ukraine in the 1920s had quite a large following among the youth, and also among the peasants in the Volhynia region of Ukraine.
Can you say just a little bit about then how those events fed into the communities in North America and the politics of those communities in terms of the conservative politics versus the left in this part of the world?
Yeah, I think, though, you have to go a little bit further than I went, which is that there was the Soviet occupation of Galicia and Volhynia, these two regions which had been part of Poland, and also of northern Bukovina, which had been part of Romania. And that in case of Galicia was a 21-month occupation, almost 2 years. In the case of Bukovina, it was somewhat less, a little bit, about a year and a half, because it was annexed in June of 1940. And maybe not, actually a year, basically, of Soviet occupation. Problem with that period was that there was immense repression, first of the Polish population and of the Polish elite. So the USSR had been killing its Polish population throughout the 1930s. In fact, it's a real genocide, which is rarely discussed. They were killing the Polish population, feeling that they were a dangerous element because they had relatives and co-nationals in Pilsudski's Poland, or the Poland of the colonels, definitely an anti-communist regime. And so when they came in there, they deported and sent to special settlements numerous Poles, particularly those who had been in the Polish administration, those who had occupied any important position. Economically affluent Poles were sent off. Also, large numbers of Jews were arrested, mainly on charges of Zionism or Bundism, or Trotskyist leanings, or being former communists of the Polish Communist Party, which was banned. So there was a lot of murder of those people too, Jews. But at the end of the occupation, they started arresting Ukrainian nationalists, or those suspected of Ukrainian nationalism. And when the Soviets retreated in the face of the very rapid German blitzkrieg advance, they could not evacuate all these political prisoners, which was their intention. So put them in labor camps or special settlements in the east of the Soviet Union. And instead, they murdered them. So about 15,000 Ukrainian, about 15,000, mainly Ukrainian, but not entirely, political prisoners were murdered in late June of 1941 after the attack was launched. So, in short, that period was really brutal. In addition to that, you have to understand that the population underwent Sovietization also of their economy. Before the Soviets took Western Ukraine in 1939, it was hardly, I would call it, prosperous area. But it was, it was recovering from the Depression. There was no real starvation. There were poor people, of course, poor peasants in particular, but it was kind of a normal place to live. When the Soviets came in 1939, they did a number of things right away. First, they incited class warfare in the villages, and they urged poor peasants to steal from the rich peasants. Then they nationalized all the businesses. So, many Jews were out of work, of course. And they persecuted the church, the Ukrainian church, and all the churches, really, all the religions suffered. And economically, they allowed the Red Army soldiers who occupied Galicia and Volhynia to buy goods at almost giveaway prices. And they put an artificial value on the ruble to make it possible for them to just buy so much. And the Soviets just cleaned up, and they sent things back home from where their families came from. Soviet officials and Soviet personnel were quartered with Galician homes, and they sent from those homes pianos and all kinds of things that their hosts had. There were frequent arrests. What had once been, like before the invasion, there had been a really lively life of periodicals, in Galicia. You could read Zionist, Bundist, Ukrainian nationalist, Trotskyist, Polish periodicals of all sorts, from the far right to the far left. And then, as of September of 1939, there were only very short little newspapers modeled on Pravda, giving almost no information. So intellectual life plummeted. Many of the professors were exiled for their views. And in addition to all this, life became very drab. Nobody would go out in their clothes, their fancy clothes, or their nice-looking hats, because they might be considered bourgeois and capable of being arrested. So let me just say that I've never found a memoir of anybody during the Soviet period, except for some Jews who fared better, that liked the Soviet regime of 39 to 41. And in fact, most people were hated it. So when the Germans come in June of 1941, on the whole, they're welcomed by the population, because it seems to be an end of this incredible violence that the Soviets had inflicted on the population. At least that's the way it seemed at first. And many people were eager to support them, even with their anti-Jewish policies, because that didn't really seem to matter to at least ethnic Ukrainians, many of them at least. And another thing that happened that's important to understand is that the Soviets, during the period that they were in charge of Galicia and Volhynia, disbanded all Ukrainian political parties, all Ukrainian organizations. Only those things which would be created anew and approved by the Soviet regime were allowed. Only one Ukrainian group managed to survive underground during the Soviet occupation. Not only survive underground, but in fact increase its membership. And that was the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which was allied with the fascist forces of Europe, and which was tremendously anti-Semitic and anti-communist. And when the Germans came in, all the Soviet officials who had been in the administration evacuated. And the underground nationalists had already had plans to put in place their own people in the civil administration under Germany, under the German occupation. So that meant that there was going to be quite a bit of pro-German sentiment and activities. So the civil administration, actually everywhere under the German rule occupations, participated greatly in the Holocaust. It participated in the contributions, that is the sort of appropriation of goods, particularly produce from the peasantry and other things. The civil administration had to do that. A lot of people were involved in propaganda for the Germans. A lot of people were in the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, and they were involved in a kind of distanced collaboration with the Germans. There was Ukrainian police, which were heavily involved in sending forced laborers to Germany and also in the Holocaust. So there was this vast population which had collaborated with the Germans. Hardly any of them remained behind when the Soviets came. They evacuated to the West, and they ended up in Canada, and of course in America and Great Britain and Australia. And for them, they tried to minimize always their own crimes under the German occupation and not exaggerate, because there was absolutely no need to exaggerate, but to justify their actions in light of the Soviet crimes. So I think that massive emigration, which occurred about 1950, a few years before, a few years after, explains why there would be such a dominance of that virulent anti-communist, soft on fascism ideology, because these people who evacuated, they were often the intelligentsia, they were people administration, they were the kind of people who would be the future leaders of the Ukrainian community in Canada and America. I think that answers your question in more depth than you wanted.
No, I think it's very helpful for people, and I want to just connect it now to one little fragment of history that some listeners in Canada and some people in the States who listen to this podcast and elsewhere might have heard about, and that's the so-called Himka scandal. So, mostly people who don't know anything about Ukrainian history will have heard of this, how in September of 2023, Yaroslav Himka, who at the time was 98, was given 2 standing ovations by members of parliament when he visited Canada's House of Commons, where he was identified as a war veteran who had fought for Ukraine's independence from Russia. The visit was the result of his son's request to the Speaker of the House of Commons, who at the time was the MP for the riding where the son lives. But of course, it quickly became known that in 1943, Himka had volunteered to serve in the SS Division Galicia, a Nazi military unit mostly made up of Ukrainians from Galicia. And this unit had taken part in the suppression of the anti-Nazi resistance uprising in Slovakia in 1944, and also in mass killings of Polish civilians that year. Himka was just one of hundreds of veterans of this SS unit who were allowed to enter Canada as immigrants after the Second World War. So what do you think that the responses to this incident tell us about anti-communism in Canada in the past and present?
Well, I would say that the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies and various community leaders in the Ukrainian community tried to defend the Waffen-SS Division Galicia, and they really haven't been able to understand why, objectively speaking, they shouldn't be doing that. That there's a kind of morality issue here. The people who are in the division, we call them the Divizinike because they came in the Divizia. The Divizinike were very prominent members of the community. Most of them had been kids, by the way, when they were in the division. They did remarkable stuff. They were a real feature of our community. We knew them personally. I had a good colleague who shared with my interests in stamp collecting and philately. I have a relative who was one of the best raconteurs I've ever heard in my life. And a person I owe a lot of I have a lot of respect for, and who I really owe to, was a member of the division also, Peter Savarin, who had been the chancellor of the University of Alberta. So on a personal level, we all knew these people, and they were generally less crazy than many people in the diaspora were. But I think here's the problem, the way I see it, David. The Waffen-SS Division Galicia committed a number of bad acts. Not all members of the division were involved in everything. So if you want to start, we could go to February 1940, when they were doing an advanced group of the division was sent to the city of Brode. And at that time, the Germans decided that they would liquidate the last remnants of the Jewish community in Brode, and they wanted all available personnel to take part. No document says that the division took part, but all available personnel would normally have included a Waffen-SS division. And then there were the incidents with Poles, and those were only also partial groups within the division. Like a police unit was involved in Huta Pieniacka, and in some of the others, they cooperated with the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, their armed forces, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. And then the suppression of the Slovak national uprising. Many Jews were fighting for their life in the Slovak national uprising. It was their hope to be able to make an uprising and not be deported into the death camps, which was going on steadily under Tiso's regime in Slovakia. And the suppression of that uprising was not only a suppression of anti-fascists, but a suppression of Jews who were fighting for their lives. So this is the real history, and some of the Ukrainian educational or academic institutions have been trying to defend the division, but they really don't get it. They don't understand what the history was, and it's kind of, I would say, deliberate, not wanting to know the real history. In my view, these academic institutions should be educating the Ukrainian diaspora about history, not taking the diaspora's own kind of distorted view of history and trying to convince the rest of the world of it, which is what happened in the Himka situation. It's just a totally innocent guy. He fought the Russians back then. He never fought the Russians because there was the Battle of Brod. Very few of the division survived that one, and of those who survived, not all of them rejoined. And then they really were immediately sent to Slovakia. So they weren't really fighting the Reds as they were supposed to be doing, only on the Eastern Front. And I should say that as the division progressed, many people who were looking for an exit from Ukraine, people who had been deeply implicated in Holocaust crimes, joined the division not even from Galicia, but from all over, and they would join as a way of getting out of the Soviet Union and fighting their way to the West. So it's a complicated story, and it's even more complicated than I'm telling you.
Well, this is certainly a much more illuminating overview than what most people would have picked up from the mainstream media accounts around the time of the Himka affair. Now, it doesn't take a lot of insight to recognize anti-communist ideology that tries to minimize the significance of collaboration with Nazi Germany, or to even justify it for what it is. And so it's some people on the left who've pointed this out have done so without great difficulty. But I think some of the responses from the left to this history leave a lot to be desired, in that they don't understand how conditions in the USSR and in other countries that came under its control were fertile soil for anti-communism among people there and among immigrants from those places. So can we circle back and talk about Ukraine? You touched on this earlier, but to say a little more about the situation in Ukraine inside the USSR during the 1920s and into the 1930s, including the famine, but not just the famine, in terms of what was everyday life like, and what did people experience from, say, 1928 on?
Well, in 1928, I think the first of the kind of show trials occurs, the Shakhta trial of engineers in Ukraine. And then those trials just mushroom into the Great Terror of 37, 38. So people were rather frightened. And the way that the NKVD worked, we now know so much more about it because of the opening of archives and dogged research of people like Lynn Viola. The way it worked was if somebody was brought in for questioning, the NKVD would consider it normal that they should just be broken and confess, and then they would be murdered. So, and whether they were guilty or not, they would eventually confess. And then they were also forced to name other names of people that they thought, that were colluding with them in their anti-Soviet activities, which were, in the first place, imagined usually. And then they would bring in those people. And then those people would also be tortured, and they would also get new names. So we saw how it worked. And so it was a situation in which many people could be quite frightened. People like, I could say, the famous Soviet filmmaker, Alexander Dovzhenko. Well, he survived, but he was always worried. Everybody was always worried. You could easily make a mistake, or the winds of change of ideology could come. It was best to keep as low. It was good if you could keep a low profile, but you were also supposed to be very active in making communism. So you were in this kind of dilemma where you're constantly walking on eggshells because on the one hand, you have to be really engaged. And on the other hand, if you are engaged and the winds change, then you're going to be arrested. And, certain national groups were targeted for, like I said, the Poles were a victim of real genocide in the 1930s in the Soviet Union. Genocide in the loose sense that they were targeted for mass killing. And, there wasn't much intellectual life, but the sciences and mathematics could still flourish. It was very dangerous to work in the humanities. And as for the everyday aspects of life, once collectivization was embarked upon, then the agricultural sphere was ruined, and there was tremendous food shortages throughout the Soviet Union, not just in Ukraine. I feel what happened in Ukraine is that the effects of a countrywide famine were displaced into Ukraine. This is something like Ethiopians did as well when they were having their famine in the 70s. They just displaced it into areas that were restive and seeking separatism. So this is not a totally unknown government tactic. So food was hard to get unless you were a communist official. If you were a high communist official, you could have your own. What they used to have these trains, special trains, one car or two for communist officials, stocked with imported canned fish and champagne and meats and produce. They could live very well. It was part of the big deal that was done in the Soviet Union. But ordinary people, they suffered. They had problems getting enough food. And it's not just food, it was medicine. Doctors were complaining a lot in the Soviet Union about the lack of food. They had hospitals, but they couldn't give them the medicine that most people needed, which was food. So it's hard for us to imagine. We live in a country where food waste is a big problem, and they live in a place where people were gathering acorns, killing squirrels, anything to get any nutrition, especially in the countryside. So conditions were difficult. They didn't have access to all the vibrant intellectual life of that just starts on their western border or even on their eastern borders. They lived in a silo, an intellectual silo. They were sure that the leadership was sure that they were doing the right thing, and everybody had to kowtow to them. I mean, we look at our situation now and we think, oh my God, it might be Trump, it might be Biden, it might be whatever, but it's not Stalin. This is a situation which is hard to understand. How many people were arrested? How many people were sent to special settlements, into exile, into labor camps? And sometimes that, it's being sent into a labor camp, you would end up someplace on the tundra, and they would say, build yourself a camp. And they didn't really have to have many guards in these places because there's no place to run to. The church, many people, the Orthodox population of the Soviet Union was devastated until World War II, during which time the Patriarch of Moscow was resurrected by Stalin after years of no appointment as a patriarch. But churches were closed, priests were tortured. It wasn't a happy place to be.
I'd like to focus just on the famine a little bit more because, again, people who don't know very much about the history may have heard something of this. And because of the way that the famine that happened in Ukraine is often presented as a deliberate attempt by Stalin to carry out a genocide against Ukrainians, right? And even people who are not in the Ukrainian-Canadian community might have heard the term the Holodomor. Could you say a little bit about that particular ideological interpretation of the famine, which I think has had a fair bit of influence?
Yeah, I don't think that it's a helpful interpretation. That is, if you really want to understand what happened. I don't think that the famine was unleashed in order to kill Ukrainians. I think the famine was unleashed because of Soviet agricultural policy. I mean, if you read the book by Davies and Wheatcroft, Years of Hunger, you can see how crazy, how stupid was the implementation of this total collectivization. You had, first, such a thing as getting rid of the kulaks. Who were the kulaks? They were the successful farmers. I've read a story of kulaks who were rounded up for deportation, but they were deporting so many kulaks they just stuck them in a ravine. To wait until they could get a train to come and take them away. And in that time, all these kulaks grew watermelons, took them out to the population and sold them. Well, that's an anecdote. But the point is, the kulaks were successful farmers. So you deport all the successful farmers, and you get bright-eyed young Marxist workers from the cities to come and manage agriculture. I mean, really. I mean, right when I say it, you can see how stupid this is. But they didn't think of it that way. They thought the peasant works slowly, the peasant works for himself. We're going to show them what factory work is like. We're going to make it go much faster and much better. Peasants work really hard. My grandmother was a peasant. She told me how she worked. It's a rough thing. Anyways, so they did that. They alienated the peasantry as well. And throughout history, when we have slavery, when we have serfdom, what does the slave or serf do? The slave or serf works the minimum. Well, collectivization also had people working the minimum. It also had tremendous effects in the countryside. So anyways, I'm going to say this right now. If you had to, there was, I think it was in 2010, 2011 or so, the Ukrainian security services made a list of about 40 perpetrators of the Holodomor, the famine. And about half of them, or 40% of them, were Jewish or non-Ukrainians. In reality, if you had to look at all the perpetrators by ethnicity, there's no question that the vast majority, overwhelming majority of perpetrators were Ukrainians, because this was done in the villages. Teachers, village mayors, all the Soviet staff that every village had was lined up to enforce the austere regulations that pertained during the famine. Nobody could hide grain or hide food. If people ate food and they seemed to be doing okay, then their food could be taken away, and it would be taken by the people in the village, their own neighbors. So it set up a very poisonous situation in the countryside. And if, again, when I look at collaborators during the Second World War, people who survived the famine but lost relatives were among those who were very active in the German police, or the police and German service. It's not unlike the many Jews who, after the pogroms of 1919 by the Pelures, by the Ukrainian National Army, they joined the Cheka and then the NKVD because of what they'd experienced. I mean, this is what happens when people are abused. They they look for a way to, not all of them, but a significant portion will look to gain some kind of retribution. So, and the famine, they did so many, besides exiling all the prosperous farmers and replacing them with dedicated workers from the city to lead the agriculture. The people who designed the collectivization knew very little about agriculture. They wanted more wheat because there was not enough wheat. So what did they do? They just, year after year, they put the fields that should have been fallow, they seeded them with wheat, which of course meant that they would get weedy and they'd spend a lot of time with exhausted, and the peasants themselves were exhausted because they weren't getting the proper nutrition. So they were creating one stupid thing after another stupid thing. And the result of that was a famine throughout the USSR, where I feel it becomes really anti-Ukrainian is when they decide that they're going to feed some parts of the Soviet Union more and let the Ukrainian peasantry perish. So, Stalin says that that Pilsudski in Poland wants to take over Ukraine, and therefore it's a very dangerous place. We should repress them. So that's how I look at the famine. I think it's a crime of stupidity and malice, but it causes about 4 million deaths in Ukraine and about 1 million in Kazakhstan, the forced collectivization, and I don't know how many exactly in Russia, but the Don Cossacks in particular suffered huge losses, and everybody was pinched except the Communist Party elite.
Yeah, and the whole dispossession of the peasantry, which happened under this collectivization from above, it's like dispossession of peasants in other times and places. It's always a devastating process, but you've, I think, illuminated it in a very helpful way. Before we move on from the famine, if you could just say one or two things about this, it's maybe an odd question, but because of the obvious problems in the account of the famine that you get from right-wing Ukrainian nationalists and other anti-communists, there are some people on the left who then essentially today parrot what defenders of the USSR used to say about the famine. So I'm wondering if you could just say just a little bit about what defenders of the USSR later had to say about the famine, and maybe offer a few critical comments about that too.
Yeah, I think that a good example would be this book by Douglas Tottle, which got pretty wide currency in its time, at least on the left, which pointed out that the Germans used the famine in their propaganda in the 1930s, in their anti-Soviet propaganda. And of course, that would have been under Nazi Germany. And that the Ukrainian nationalists, particularly from Galicia, made a big issue of the famine to call attention to their own sufferings and minimize any possible remembrance of war crimes which they might have been involved in. So that was kind of the kernel of the book. And there were aspects of it that were actually true. The German Nazis did this. They used faked photographs to talk about the famine, or to demonstrate the famine. The photographs from 1921 were used to show the famine of 1932-33. This is all true. In fact, also the Ukrainian researcher Marko Tsarenik, whose work is very valuable, also he was involved in one of the films about the famine, and he said that they shouldn't use photos from the 1921 famine as proof of the 1932-33 famine. A lot of people got mad at him in the community for doing that, for saying that. So, there's a grain of truth there, but the actual fact is that the real famine is totally a result of Soviet policy. And it was a real famine that killed millions of people. And it wasn't stopped even when it could be seen that this was what was happening. And if you look at the total number of people killed in 1932-33 in the famine in the USSR, it comes to at least 5 and probably closer to 6 million. It's a huge number of people. So I think that here's my perspective. And I think you have to look at what people suffered, regardless of whether they're Jewish, Arab, Ukrainian, German, Russian, and give an honest account of it, and not use these great tragedies like the Holocaust or the famine to instrumentalize for Ukrainian independence or for a Zionist state. I just feel that you have to respect these vast numbers of people who are victims of murder. You have to treat it, I feel, with a certain dignity. It's not something to be tossed around in an argument. That's my honest feeling. It's been my feeling for a long time that I just can't stand it when people throw out some huge tragedy where so many people suffered so much. If I say 6 million Jews died, we think, well, that's terrible. It's a big number. But I'm a Holocaust scholar. I know how it goes. I know that the story of every individual as they tried to survive all these terrible things that were happening, it's not a number. It's not a number at all. It's a diffusion of intense suffering. So you have to treat that with respect.
Yeah, I certainly agree. We'll be moving towards the end of the conversation, but I did want to also bring up the question of the ways in which people in Ukraine and Ukrainians elsewhere responded to Stalin's depression. Because from some people on the left today, you get the impression that the only response was people who were not loyal to the USSR were then Nazi collaborators or right-wing nationalists. But I'm wondering if you could just give people a bit of a sense of the various different ways that people who are Ukrainian living under the rule of Stalin and the Stalinist ruling class articulated their opposition, like the range of different responses. You did mention already, of course, that the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists in one particular region of Western Ukraine was able to organize and strengthen itself. But again, people who don't know anything about Ukrainian history, I think, need to understand something about that diversity. So I'm wondering if you could just paint a bit of a picture for people.
Well, within the Soviet Union itself, there were not many options for expressing your disagreement. And any expression of disagreement could have serious consequences. There's this famous Soviet joke that comes out of that era where two political prisoners are talking and they say, how did you end up in here? And the guy says, well, I'm here because of laziness. He says, what do you mean? He says, well, my friend and I were telling anti-Soviet jokes, and I was too lazy to go and report it. But he did. But obviously these jokes did circulate underground, and I've seen some of them in the documents. These jokes and so that's one of the things that gets people through a lot of terror, is actually their ability from time to time to see the absurdity of what's happening, even though it's a very, very dangerous absurdity. But outside the Soviet Union, there were many more means of expression of it. And so there were liberal parties, Ukrainian liberal parties, there were Ukrainian socialist parties, and they ranged from very kind of centrist and peasant-oriented socialist parties to the Communist Party of Western Ukraine, which had very few Ukrainian leaders, but was still strong in Volhynia on the eve of World War II. But there were also a very small Trotskyist movement in Western Ukraine with some outstanding figures. One was Roman Rozdolsky, who wrote The Making of Marx's Capital. Another was Ludwig Chorny Rosenberg, who was a totally Ukrainianized Jew, who was also involved in the Trotskyist opposition in Western Ukraine. And he was murdered by the Soviets almost as soon as they came in. He's one of the first people the NKVD went after. Him and Stefan Rudek was another in the Trotsky. So they're them. The church, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, was anti-communist, but during the Soviet occupation, it was loyal. to the Soviets, which is a normal policy of churches, to not irritate the regime under which they have to function. But they were definitely anti-communist, and particularly for them, the atheistic regime of the Soviet Union was a major problem. And they suffered from it themselves in the period 39-41, and then again after 44. I think those are the main currents that were anti-Soviet on the eve of the occupation of 39-41.
And then what would you have found in the diaspora, among Ukrainian immigrants in Canada in terms of range of different political perspectives at that time?
Oh my God. The range there was huge. So to start on the far left, a lot of the Ukrainians in Canada were Bolsheviks. Coal miners, domestic workers in the cities, people who were lumberjacks, a lot of them belonged to organizations affiliated with the Ukrainian Bolshevik movement. Then there were also progressive Ukrainians who were involved in the foundation of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Canada. They were nationalistic, and they supported the Central Rada. They were anti-Bolshevik, but they were fairly progressive people. They condemned Nazism. They condemned the kind of nationalism that the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists had. They were a bit of an elite, but they worked through churches which they founded, and they became an important movement. And then there was Ukrainian Greek Catholics. They were also anti-Soviet, but their main concern was providing liturgical, spiritual help for the Ukrainians who were spread across the prairies and often in remote locations. And then already just about as soon as the right-wing organization of Ukrainian Nationalists was founded in Ukraine,
which was when?
1929. It was actually founded in Vienna, but nonetheless, they were all in exile for Ukraine. Immediately, they had representatives in the community, but they became very important in the community only after World War II. And even after World War II, there was much more diversity in the Ukrainian community, because it wasn't just the people who had been collaborating in one way or another with the German regime who came, but there were also people from Soviet Ukraine who managed to escape, and they weren't quite as crazy as the nationalists by any means. They're the kind of people who every time there was a thaw in the Soviet Union, like 1960s, they would pack their bags being ready to go back, hoping that, now was the moment, or they would, they founded an organization, Ukrainian Free Academy of Arts and Sciences in the U.S., UVAN in Ukrainian, we call it UVAN. And they collected all Ukrainian diaspora periodicals so that they could send them back to Ukraine as soon as Ukraine became free. And they had a very charismatic leader by the name of Ivan Bakhriane, who was an intellectual in the old country, condemned fascism, condemned the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. One of my favorite sayings of his was that the nationalists never evolved beyond fascism. All they did is pretend that they were never fascists. So there was a lot of diversity in the community. But as time went on, and as people lost their regular contact with Ukraine and Ukrainian affairs, as the language began to diminish, it was very easy for the right to take over Ukrainian community life. They'd been involved in infiltrating for a long time. They understood the importance of power, and so they sort of took over the helm of the intellectual and political life of the Ukrainian diaspora. But if you went back to, say, 1955 or 1960, it would have been a much more diverse community. So, there used to be many Ukrainian youth groups. There was Plast, which was actually affiliated with the Melnik faction of the OUN. There was SUM, which was affiliated with the Banderite faction of OUN. But there was also ODUM, which was the organization of the Democratic Ukrainian Youth, which was from mainly people from former Soviet, main Soviet Ukraine. There was also SUMK, which was the Orthodox youth group. So there were there's a real diversity. Now most of these organizations are transformed because, of course, now we have a huge, and everything is changing right now. And the old diaspora used to be in charge. They're still more articulate in English and put their program forward. But nowadays, the real power lies in people who came from independent Ukraine. It's quite a difference.
Just to close off, then, I'm wondering if you have any last thoughts about the consequences today of leftists criticizing anti-communism without also adopting a critical stance towards the so-called socialism of the USSR in Stalinism, with people who don't criticize the USSR from the same kind of emancipatory perspective with which they ought to criticize capitalism.
Yeah, well, as I say, you have to be honest about Soviet crimes and communist crimes. People are people. If you start killing them, if you start arresting them, you start exiling them, you start putting them in labor camps, you're doing wrong. And if you don't recognize that wrong, then you're complicit in that wrong. That's the way I feel about it. And I think that a more sober look at all these issues, it does not resolve when you realize that, oh yes, the Nazis were terrible and the Stalinists were terrible. It's not a competition, and it's not your crime justifies my crime. No, you just have to be really honest about what happened, unless you agree with the Stalinists. Unless you agree that it's best to get rid of a certain segment of the population which might be disloyal, and murder is not important. But I don't have those values, and I don't think they should either.
That's, I think, a great place to end. Thank you.
Okay, David, thank you.
That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.